Hi, my name's Katrina. I came here from New Zealand. Currently my laptop is telling me it's 11:30 at night. It's very weird to fly 40 hours and then be completely the wrong way round. But thank you for having me and coming to listen to the talk. So last year I made a New Year's resolution, and I decided in January last year that I was going to write a book. Spoilers. I did. So I signed up to LeanPub. They have this big red button on the front page of LeanPub that says write a book, and I clicked it, and I had this really clear picture of what I thought I wanted my book to be. And I remember writing out the introduction, and I was like, man, this is going to be amazing, this is so easy. And then I had this moment where I realized that I had no idea what I was doing. And I literally went to Google and typed in, how long should a book be? And how do people write books? Because I suddenly had this moment of, oh, I'm way out of my depth. And I think New Year's resolutions are kind of like milestone birthdays. They're these dangerous things where we make goals, even though we have kind of no evidence that we're going to be any good at these things. Like we decide we want to run a marathon or write a book. And I think it's only once you start that you realize there's that complexity or difficulty that you kind of hadn't foreseen. So everyone can write. Like if you see a child, they can write their name. You can write, I hope. Your favorite novelist can write, but there's a spectrum, right? And there's a difference between being able to do something and being able to do it really well. And I think we set goals at kind of those higher levels when we have some basic skill. So because I can write, like how much harder can it really be to write a book? Like I kind of imagine that that leap isn't as much as perhaps it is. So you're probably not setting any New Year's resolutions about testing, but what I'm hoping is that you're all doing some form of testing in your role. If you check that your product works, congratulations, you're a tester. But it's the same in testing as it is in writing. There's that spectrum of literacy. And I think we have a bit of a problem in IT where there are a lot of people who assume that they are novelists of testing. And I don't mean that there's people kind of walking around being like, I'm the best tester, I'm awesome. It's not an overt arrogance. It's more of a passive arrogance where people kind of feel that they don't have anything to learn about testing. It's not something that they need to dig into because, yeah, I already do that. And what I'd like to invite you to assume is that your level of testing literacy perhaps isn't where you think it is. Even if you're sitting there and you're like, yeah, I already do this. I invite you to assume that perhaps there might be something else here. So what I want you to imagine is that you as a tester is kind of like this girl who's digging for shellfish on a beach. So she's an explorer of sorts, and you can see that she's got her head down, she's in one place, she's got a stick there that's her tool that's helping her, and she's definitely finding stuff. Like there is shellfish in her bucket. And like I said, you're probably all doing some form of testing in your role, and you probably are finding problems through the testing that you're doing, but perhaps there are opportunities for you to move around the beach, find different types of problems, and pick up different sticks. So that's what I want to talk to you about through this talk. First, I want to start with why. So why should you care about this? Why should testing be something that you need to learn more about? Testing is part of your role. So it's important for you to improve your testing literacy so that you can do your role well. And when I say testing, I'm talking about testing, like the wide view of it, and not the girl on the beach with her head down in one spot. So this expectation that testing is part of your role is something that I think has arrived with Agile and with DevOps. So I just want to briefly talk about why I think this. So in a waterfall team, right, we had the tester who owned testing, that blue bubble. It belonged to them. Something came in, we tested it, it disappeared out the other side. In Agile, we started to share ownership of testing. So within the delivery team, other people were involved, and we started talking about that shared ownership of quality. In DevOps, we're pushing this even further. And when I talk about DevOps, I'm not talking about a role, a person. I'm talking about the culture change. So actually getting the development team and the operations team to work together. And in that type of culture, the people who are beyond your delivery team and who are part of supporting your products and production become part of the testing that you do. So when I talk about this with testers, they have some concern about this model, because if testing is everywhere, and what am I supposed to do here? And to them I say, testing is like air in a DevOps world. It's all around, but people might not know to go looking for it. And your role as the tester is to teach people to breathe continuously and naturally. When I say that to testers, I'm assuming that the people in this picture actually want to, right? Because there's no use a tester going around and being like, breathe, and everyone standing there stubbornly like, I am not going to do this. So imagine learning to breathe in a new environment. So this is a picture of me snorkeling in South America. It was awesome. But I'm not a huge water person. So you know when you're kind of learning to breathe underwater, sometimes you have these moments where you're like, oh, and you freak out and you have to stick your head up and kind of breathe normally for a while before you can go again. I think when you're not testing in DevOps, you have these moments as well. So if you haven't learned to breathe continuously and naturally, you kind of have these periods of time where the whole team comes up and kind of gasps for air before you can keep going again. So some examples of this. Anyone who has a security testing sprint or a performance testing sprint. In my organisation, when we hit a certain number of prod issues, they introduce extra governance steps to slow everyone down. So it's because you're not breathing properly all the time, you have to pause and start. But there comes a point where if you're truly working together collaboratively and trying to reach that rapid release cycle, that you can't come up for air. Like, if you're deep in this world and you're not breathing continuously and naturally, testing all the time, eventually there's going to be trouble. So I feel that everyone does need to learn to test. How can you do this? So there's two main things that I want to talk about. One is about getting you moving around the beach, and one is getting you to use your tools in a different way and at different times. So changing the questions that you ask is trying to get people moving around. So in 2014, Facebook, they were pushing tens of hundreds of diffs to their production environment every hour. They had automated tests, they've got tiered releases, they had emergency stop buttons, they do employee dog fooding. Like, their test approach is really cool. Also in 2014, they released their memories feature, where you can see things that you posted on Facebook in prior years, and the reviews that summarize up kind of a period of time and show you what's been happening. And those features started to show people things like this. This is a screenshot of someone's ex-boyfriend's apartment that caught fire, and Facebook showed that picture as the summary of their whole year. Hey, remember how your apartment burnt down? Wasn't that cool? And this is kind of funny, but the algorithm was also doing things that are not funny, like reminding people who had lost friends or family members about their passing. So how do you know that something's okay? How do you decide whether it's ready or not for your users, for your production environment? So I want you to imagine a restaurant. and this is a special restaurant. You're going to go to lunch at 12 o'clock today, and you spend some time eating, and you leave the restaurant an hour later, but it is 1 o'clock tomorrow. So an hour of time has passed for you, and 25 hours of time has passed for everyone else in the outside world. How do you figure out that that's happened? So maybe you pull out your cell phone and you've got, lots of notifications. Depending on how you live your life, that may not tell you anything. Maybe the weather's changed. I don't know about you, but in my home city, the weather changing also isn't that reliable of an indicator. Maybe you've got a parking ticket. Maybe you see a newspaper with a different date on it. Maybe you've got missed calls from your loved ones. I'm sure you can think of any number of things that can help you figure out that something's a bit off. So these things, the ways that we determine whether something is wrong, are oracles. So these are the principles or mechanisms by which we figure out that there's a problem. And there is a slide missing. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the oracles that we use. So these are the questions that we ask and how we figure out stuff is wrong. So if you work in a development team, often when you test, your focus or your place on the beach is, does this work how we think it should? So I'm going to find my user story or my requirements, and I'm going to be coding or exploring around what I've been told that this thing should do. And that's both positive and negative scenarios. It might be functional and non-functional requirements, but it's all the claims that we make about the software that we want to ask questions about. If I work in an ops environment, my spot on the beach is usually, does it work how it usually works? As in, I want to look at the history of my application, and I'm testing to see whether it's still consistent with past behavior that I've seen. That's my spot. That's the way I'm going to figure out what's wrong. Both those things are things that the user can't tell. The user doesn't know how you think it should have worked. And most of the time, the user doesn't know how it's worked before to the same degree that you do. So how do they tell that it's broken? What are some of the other ways that you can figure out that your software is not working? So does it work how someone of your user base actually wants it to work? So the user experience. Does it work in a similar way to your competitors? When you put it into the market, are you ahead of them, behind them, comparable? Does your product work in a similar way to other products from your organization? Does it meet the need it was designed for without harmful side effects? So Niall yesterday talked about going to the dark place and trying to figure out all the ways that someone could use this incorrectly. Does it meet your legal obligations? So there's a bunch of questions you can start asking that push you towards different oracles for figuring out if something is wrong. So there's a little mnemonic that kind of sums up. This is very basic testing mnemonic. History, image, comparable products, claims, user expectations, product purpose, and statutes. So the purpose of using something like this as a tester is to say, okay, how can I change my perspective and think about the software from a different angle, ask a different question, and see if there are any problems here that I haven't found. So I want to give you some examples of how when you change your oracle, it changes the way you think about if there's a problem or not. So if I'm developing an onboarding form for a bank, and I'm in a development team, my natural tendency here is to code some tests as we go, to grab the user story and validate against that. But if we switch the oracle, so if we're going to go away from claims and start thinking about our competitor products, how could we tell whether our onboarding experience was better or worse than other people in our market? So for something like this, you're probably not going to go and open a whole bunch of accounts, bank accounts at different banks. Like, that's not going to work. But there are a whole bunch of industry consultants out there who do these studies of different functionality or different industries and tell you what the benchmarks are. So this is just some random study I pulled off the internet. It's looking at retail banks in Luxembourg, and you can see that they've identified 17 criteria for a good onboarding process. And if I dig into that, then I can start to assess my product in a completely different way. So this isn't anymore about what we think it should do. This is now about what Deloitte in Luxembourg think we should do. And the types of problems that I find by switching my Oracle are very different. And I feel like when I give this talk to devs, I feel like there's people sitting here thinking, yeah, but we have a BA for this. Like, the BA kind of cares about all this stuff. Yes, but if you're in that environment where you're doing DevOps and your deploy is really rapid, and from when you commit the code, it's going to your customer, at what point is someone else getting involved to do this type of testing if it's not you? Example from an ops perspective. So they're generally biased towards, does it work how it usually works, right? So if I'm looking at a normal day in our online banking platform, this is number of sessions at the top, and then a day where maybe it's not so normal, something weird has happened around lunchtime. If my Oracle is, does this work how it usually works? No. So there's a problem. But if I flip the Oracle and say, okay, how about I look at another product on the same platform? So the top is the graph we were looking at before. It's from our mobile platform. The bottom is the same. So it's our online banking on our web-based platform. And they both had the same thing happen. And then I'm like, well, maybe it's not a problem, because it looks like all of the different services that are running are doing the same thing at this point. Last one, audit. So I work in a bank, and in Australia and New Zealand at the moment, there's a really big piece of work. There's some regulation authorities coming in to audit the different banks, because New Zealand banks are owned by Australian parents, and they're looking at how we meet standards and policies and laws. And I think audit is a great example of where people come up for air, and you just suddenly think, oh, let's just stop what we were doing and figure out, like, are we actually compliant with all the things we're supposed to be? And then do all the work to get us compliant where we've missed some stuff. So if you were asking different questions through your pipelines, so instead of, does this work the way we think it should, how about we also ask, does this work the way that the standards and our auditors think it should? So there was a talk that I saw at the WeTest conference in New Zealand a few weeks ago. Murnau talked about using InSpec for continuous compliance testing through a pipeline. So this is about shifting that Oracle, finding different types of problems. So what I really want for developers, operations people to do is to think about how they're figuring out that there's a problem here, and what question could they ask to find a different type of problem. So I think in testing, we talk a lot about the testing mindset, like it's a magic thing. But actually, even though you can't teach curiosity necessarily, you can teach people some techniques and heuristics to kind of fake it. And this is a way of prompting yourself to be curious about the other ways that your system might be broken. The other thing I want to talk about is looking for answers in new places. So this is specifically around how DevOps is opening up a lot of opportunities for us to test things in a different way and to shift where we address risk so that we can move quicker. So I assume that most people are pretty familiar with this. It's the test automation pyramid. It was in a book in the early 2000s. A guy called Mike Cohn put it together. He was not a tester, he was an agile coach. And the book was saying, when you do your automated testing, you want to have a lot more unit tests than you do service tests and the very smallest number of UI tests, because our unit tests are really quick, they're really reliable, and our UI tests are the opposite. There's a lot of people in the testing community who kind of hate this, and there's been arguments for years and years about what does this mean, can we do it this other way, da, 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 da. And then a guy in New York last year in February drew this on a whiteboard in the middle of the night and took a photo of it and put it on Twitter. And it gained a lot of traction. And he reimagined the test pyramid as a bug filter. So this is Noah Sussman. And he's saying, if you were to tip in all of the known bugs in your product into the top of this thing, unit tests should find a bunch of them, and then only the stuff that your unit tests don't catch kind of get through to the next layer. And by the time you hit production, only the most subtle bugs reach production. So I really like this because it shows a relationship between the layers that perhaps the original one didn't. But there were things about it that really bugged me. So the first one was, I was thinking about this with relation to Lego. So I don't know how familiar you are with those boxes you can buy that auto-sort Lego. So they work in a similar way. You tip in all the Lego and you shake it. And the way it works is that the top has like the widest mesh, and it gets more and more fine-grained, so that when you tip in all your Lego and you shake it, the biggest bricks kind of stay at the top, and then the medium bricks, and then all the small ones fall through to the bottom, right? If you think about that, and then look at this again, it feels kind of backwards and wrong, because unit tests aren't kind of the big things. They're all the really little stuff. So in my mind, that's the smallest mesh. But if the smallest mesh is at the top, how does anything get through further? Like all the bricks would stay up there. So the reason stuff gets through further is that it's not true that only the bugs not reduced by unit testing reach integration. The whole purpose of integration is that we're introducing other environments. And so bugs come from the systems that we are integrating with. And the other thing about this that I had issue with was that it stops when we release. So we're saying, once we go to production, it's not part of what we think about at all. So with all that in mind, here is where my brain went. So this is kind of a DevOps bug filter, where what I'm saying with this is unit tests are the things we have most of, like it's the mesh at the top, the finest mesh. And then we've got our integration and end-to-end tests. They're bigger boxes because they're covering a bigger area of our application. We are integrating with other things, but there are fewer tests there. Like if you imagine a test as a piece of wire in that mesh, there's less of them. And then part of our filter is production. Once we hit production, we're in a closed environment. And we can use our alerting, as in the things we actively get told about, our monitoring, as in the dashboards that we go and look at, and our logs, or our event management queues, if you're using something like Kafka, where it's got all that fine-grained stuff. So the coloring is kind of a parallel, like the mesh in our logging and the mesh in our unit testing are kind of the same. And then if I tip in all of the known bugs, I catch different things at different layers, because bugs change depending on where you find them. And they might manifest or might not. So if I tip in a whole bunch of stuff at the top, at the unit testing layer, I'm kind of catching those little things that could turn into something really big if they made it further, but I'm going to catch them at the top. When I get to an integrated environment or an end-to-end environment, the bugs I find feel larger. There might be a reason at the top that I could have stopped that would have prevented that thing from happening, or there might not, depending on the way it got in there, right? And the same when I hit production. Like, I want the alerting to tell me about the really big stuff. I want the monitoring to tell me about the caterpillars, and I want the logs to tell me about the little stuff at the bottom. So if we start thinking about this in terms of a test strategy in a DevOps environment, we're saying, which pieces of wire do we want to put into this meshing to catch our problems? Like, where should we be addressing these risks? And this is where I think teams aren't having the conversation, particularly about the bottom 3 boxes, to say, how far could we let this thing fall before it's an issue for us, for our organization? Like, where can this get to? Can we actually just put it out into production and then test it there? Can we use some of those assets at the bottom of the filter? So to drive this conversation, I know most people aren't going to draw like a crazy grid thing, but what I'm hoping people will start to talk about is both sides. So the strategy is no longer just thinking about we as a development team need to do unit testing and integration testing and our end-to-end testing. Instead, how do we as an organization test our software right the way through? So I want to give you some examples of this. So I kind of assume most people are doing some kind of CI and are running some kind of automated checking already. As I mentioned earlier, this is really biased towards does it work how we think it should. But this is more about where we ask the question. So why not ask that question in production? Why not? So this is all about doing it pre-release. Like, does it work how we think it should? We want to run all this stuff to make sure. If we had good monitoring that the development team had been part of implementing, and if our dashboards could tell us immediately after we did a deploy that something was wrong, and we could fix that based on the information that our alerts, monitoring, and logging had, and then we could redeploy and fix it, that'd be pretty cool. So there's a few things with this. This is a screenshot from a blog that Etsy wrote in 2010. So this is like 8 years ago. It's not a new idea. And the period of time in which this problem was out there was maybe 15 minutes. And that's kind of a challenging time to hit. Like, if you think about the number of tests you run pre-release, for many people, I think it would be challenging to hit a 15-minute window of getting that feedback pre-release. Does this work, yes or no? And I'm not advocating for this approach for everything, but I think definitely having the conversation about, do we actually need to add another check pre-release, or should we be improving our monitoring and then fixing this if it gets out there, is a conversation worth having. This is an example from my organization where we wanted to change the way that a piece of our functionality worked. So there's a blue button there that you click if your fixed rate mortgage is ending and you want to secure a new interest rate. And roughly 5% of our customers were clicking that button. And so we wanted to put in place a new solution, and the way we decided to test this was to change the wording of the button, change the wording of the messaging, and then let our customers tell us which of those would be appropriate. So again, A/B testing is not a new idea, but it's about shifting the risk and shifting where we ask the questions all the way to our customers, letting them tell us the answers, and letting go of some of the testing that we were going to do pre-release. And then from the ops space, does it work how it usually does? I think a lot of the time with this, we're waiting for our users to trigger the issues. Like, monitoring in general is kind of reactive. So start looking proactively and putting some stuff in deliberately into your production environment that's going to cause problems. So Netflix is kind of the main thing people talk about here. I work in a bank. Simi and Army is probably aspirational for us. But there's a company called PagerDuty, which do Failure Fridays, which is more time-boxed, contained, a little more risk-averse. And that's something that we could definitely embrace. And I think the challenge, when you're having these conversations in your workplace, especially if you work in a large enterprise, the challenge around risk is we should be testing in production because our customers are testing in production all the time. So we need to challenge our strategy. So there's a few things that I kind of want you to take from this. Testing is part of your role. So if you assume that it's something that you know a lot about, you're the novelist of the testing world, I guess I want to challenge you on why you think that. And if you're not already learning about testing, why not? So I think it's something that is part of every role now, and something that people need to do continuously and naturally in order for us to be able to hit that really fast release cycle that a lot of organizations are now demanding. And if you don't start learning some of these practices, it gets harder and harder to come up for air the more that your DevOps culture matures. There's a couple of key things that you can start. So changing the questions that you ask. How do you know that it's broken? How do other people know that it's broken? Can you be asking different questions about what your competitors do, or what other products in your organization are doing, or what the standards are in your industry? So I want people to stop testing and start testing. You could get the hiccups, start exploring testing a little bit and asking different questions of your software. And then finally, I want us to look in new places for answers. So DevOps gives us these opportunities. Like, for the first time, the development team and the operations team are really connected. We're collaborating together. Let's take advantage of that and really challenge the testing that we're doing pre-release and the validity of it and whether we need to address risk there. How late can you push it? How far through the mesh can you let that bug fall? Start having some of those conversations. And if you're not, I think there's probably a lot of duplication and effort happening around your organization. So this is all very high level. I kind of want to prompt you to think about it. If you want to know more detail, there's a book, which I wrote. It's on LeanPub. If you move the slider, you can take it for free. I do not mind. I'm also available via Twitter and LinkedIn if you have any questions. Thanks for listening.